after something like this, people don't always realize what they can't handle anymore.
The morning after her husband was buried, Eleanor Hart woke up to a house that no longer knew what it was for. She stood in the kitchen in her slippers, staring at the refrigerator door longer than necessary. Inside were 3 covered dishes left by neighbors, casseroles she did not remember receiving, each labeled with a name written in careful ink. She closed the door without taking anything out. Hunger felt like a question she did not have the energy to answer yet. The coffee maker beeped when it finished brewing. Eleanor poured a cup she barely tasted and carried it to the table. One chair remained empty. She did not move it. She never did. Grief did not come to Eleanor as tears. It came as weight. The mug felt heavier. The floor felt colder. Each step required thought. She washed the cup slowly, even though it was already clean, then set it on the rack exactly where her husband used to put his. His coat still hung by the door. His shoes waited at the mat, laces tied. On the wall calendar, his handwriting circled a date 3 weeks away. Beside it was a single word, written firmly, review. She touched the calendar, then stepped back. The house was quiet, but not empty. It held everything she had not yet sorted through. The doorbell rang at 10 minutes past 10. Eleanor did not rush. She folded the dish towel neatly and placed it on the counter. She had learned long ago that rushing only made things worse. On the porch stood her son, his wife, and a man Eleanor did not recognize. The man wore a dark jacket and held a thin folder under his arm. Her son looked tired in the eyes, but steady in the shoulders. Her daughter-in-law's expression was gentle and prepared. They stepped inside together. They said they were there to help. Her daughter-in-law spoke first. She always did. "This is just to take the pressure off you," she said, her hand resting briefly on the back of Eleanor's chair, as if to steady it. They sat at the dining table where Eleanor and her husband had eaten every evening for years. The man placed the folder between them and opened it without asking. Eleanor noticed small things. Her daughter-in-law did not remove her coat. The man glanced once at the framed photo on the wall and then away. No one mentioned the empty chair. Inside the folder were lists, accounts, property notes, maintenance plans. Eleanor recognized the language immediately. She and her husband had spoken this way when managing rentals years ago. This was not unfamiliar. What was unfamiliar was the assumption. Her daughter-in-law spoke calmly about structure and oversight. She said stress could be dangerous at Eleanor's age. She said decisions were easier when someone else handled them. Eleanor listened and nodded. Silence had always helped her understand what people truly meant. Her son spoke about responsibility, about making things easier. He avoided Eleanor's eyes when he spoke. "We just don't want anything to go wrong," he said. No one asked Eleanor what she wanted. The man explained efficiency, temporary authority, future planning. He spoke as if this was routine. Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, recognition. This conversation had not begun today. Her daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly. "After something like this, people don't always realize what they can't handle anymore," she said gently. Eleanor understood then that grief was being treated as proof. The visit lasted less than an hour. When they left, the house felt rearranged without anything being moved. Eleanor sat at the table long after the door closed. The folder went with them. What remained was a quiet certainty. Something had begun without her permission. She did not cry. She rinsed her mug and set it back on the rack. For the first time since her husband's death, Eleanor understood that she was not alone because she had lost him. She was alone because someone had decided she should be. The first phone call came on a Monday morning. Eleanor Hart was standing at the kitchen counter, slicing an apple the way she always had, quarters first, then each piece halved again. The radio was on low, an old talk program she half listened to, mostly for the sound of voices filling the house. It was just past 9. Her husband used to say 9 was when the day officially began. The phone rang. "Are you eating properly?" her daughter-in-law asked. The question arrived without greeting. No hello. No pause, just concern, delivered efficiently. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "I just made breakfast." There was a brief silence on the other end. Not relief, calculation. "Good," her daughter-in-law said. "I just wanted to check." They hung up less than a minute later. Eleanor returned to her apple. She noticed the slices had browned slightly where she had stopped cutting. She ate them anyway. On Wednesday, the call came again. Same time, different phrasing. "Did you remember to take your medication this morning?" Eleanor paused. Not because she didn't remember, but because she had never been asked that before. "Yes," she said. Another silence. Longer this time. "Okay," her daughter-in-law replied. "I'll tell your son." Eleanor stood at the counter for a moment after the call ended, the phone still warm in her hand. She wondered why the answer needed to be relayed. By Friday, the concern had settled into a pattern. The calls always came mid-morning, after Eleanor had already been awake for hours, after she had showered, dressed, made tea, checked the mail. The questions varied slightly, but the destination never changed. "Are you tired today? Did you sleep well? Did you lock the back door last night?" Each question landed softly. Each one stayed longer than it should have. Her son began calling too. His voice sounded careful now, measured, as if choosing words from a smaller vocabulary. "Mom, we just want to make sure you're okay," he said. "Everything's been a lot lately," he added. "At your age, stress can sneak up on you." At your age. Eleanor noticed how often that phrase appeared, always at the end of a sentence, always unchallenged. The visits started the following week. Her daughter-in-law arrived on Tuesday afternoon, carrying a bag Eleanor recognized from a local bakery. She placed it on the counter without asking where it should go. "I thought you might forget to eat," she said lightly. Eleanor thanked her and poured coffee into 2 cups. Her daughter-in-law declined. "I already had some," she said, glancing at the clock. "I can't stay long." She stayed nearly an hour. She walked through the house slowly, commenting on small things. A stack of mail on the side table, a light left on in the hallway, a throw blanket folded unevenly. "I'll straighten this," she said, already doing it. Eleanor watched. On Thursday, she returned. This time she brought brochures, not for assisted living, not yet, for home safety, grab bars, monitoring services, emergency buttons. "Just options," she said, spreading them across the dining table. No pressure. Eleanor noticed how neatly they were arranged. Her son arrived that weekend. He stood in the doorway longer than usual, as if assessing the space before entering. He hugged Eleanor briefly, then stepped back. "You look tired," he said. Eleanor had just finished gardening. Her hands still smelled of soil. They sat together in the living room. Her son spoke about work, about traffic, about nothing in particular. Then, gradually, the conversation shifted. "Have you been sleeping okay? Have you felt confused at all?" Sometimes people don't notice changes in themselves. Eleanor answered each question calmly. "No," she said. "I'm fine. I've been managing." Her son nodded, but his eyes did not settle. Later, Eleanor overheard him speaking quietly in the kitchen with his wife. "She seemed a little off today," her daughter-in-law said. She repeated herself once. Eleanor had asked the same question twice because the answer hadn't made sense the first time. That detail did not survive the retelling. The house began to feel different after that. Not unsafe. Observed. Eleanor found herself double-checking things she had never doubted before: the stove, the locks, the calendar. She began writing notes for herself, then worried what the notes might suggest if someone else read them. One afternoon, she stood in front of the refrigerator, staring at a list she had taped there: milk, eggs, apples. She tore it down and threw it away. Her daughter-in-law noticed. "You don't have to be nervous," she said later, smiling. "We're just keeping an eye on things." Keeping an eye. Eleanor understood then that concern had learned her schedule. It knew when she was tired, when she was alone, when grief softened her defenses. This was not care that waited to be needed. This was care that arrived early, stayed late, and took notes. And Eleanor realized something else, sitting alone that night with the lights off in the living room. Concern, once it settles in, does not leave on its own. It waits until it is invited to decide. "Do you remember what day it is today?" The question came while Eleanor Hart was pouring hot water into her teacup. It was not asked with worry. It was asked casually, almost cheerfully, as if the answer itself were less important than the act of asking. "Tuesday," Eleanor said. "It's supposed to rain later." Her daughter-in-law smiled. "Good," she said. "I just wanted to make sure." Eleanor carried her tea to the table and sat down. She noticed her daughter-in-law did not sit. She remained standing, leaning lightly against the counter, arms crossed loosely, watching. From that day on, the questions changed. They no longer arrived as concern. They arrived as checkpoints. "What time did you wake up today?" "Did you lock the back door last night?" "When was the last time you spoke to your sister?" Each question stood alone. Each sounded harmless. Together, they formed something Eleanor had not agreed to participate in: a test. Eleanor answered carefully. She always had. She had taught for years before retiring. She understood how questions worked. She knew when someone was listening for content and when they were listening for error. One afternoon, she paused before answering, not because she did not know, but because she was tired. The pause lasted less than a second. Her daughter-in-law's eyes sharpened. Later that evening, Eleanor's son called. "Mom," he said gently, "my wife mentioned you seemed a little confused earlier." Eleanor felt the shift immediately. "I wasn't confused," she said. "I was thinking." There was a silence on the line, a quiet recalibration. "I know," he replied. "I'm just saying we're paying attention." Paying attention. The phrase stayed with her. Small mistakes stopped being small. One morning, Eleanor misplaced her reading glasses. She searched the living room, then the bedroom, then found them exactly where she had left them, on the kitchen counter, beside the radio. An hour later, her daughter-in-law mentioned it. "You were really upset this morning," she said. Eleanor corrected her. "I wasn't upset. I just hadn't looked in the kitchen yet." Her daughter-in-law nodded sympathetically. "That's what worries me," she said. "You don't remember how distressed you were." The story improved each time it was told. Another day, Eleanor missed a doctor's appointment. The reminder card had slipped behind a drawer. She rescheduled immediately. When her son mentioned it later, the rescheduling was gone from the story. "What if it happens again?" he asked. Eleanor began to notice how context disappeared first. Facts followed later. She started writing things down: grocery lists, appointments, phone calls. Then she worried what the lists might imply. She tore some up, hid others. Her daughter-in-law noticed the hesitation. "You don't need to be nervous," she said. "We're just keeping track." Keeping track had become a habit. Conversations about Eleanor began happening in front of her, but not with her. "She forgot again yesterday," her daughter-in-law said one afternoon, speaking to her son across the table. Eleanor was sitting between them. "I didn't forget," Eleanor said calmly. I chose not to go because it was raining. Her daughter-in-law smiled. See, she said softly to her son. She gets defensive. Eleanor felt something settle then. Something heavy and final. Defense had been reclassified. Anger became agitation. Clarification became denial. Silence became confirmation. Friends noticed the shift too. A neighbor asked whether someone was staying with Eleanor now. Another asked whether her son was helping manage things. The questions were polite. They were already informed. Eleanor began to hear herself described in the past tense. She used to be so sharp, her daughter-in-law said once. Eleanor was sitting right there. At night, Eleanor lay awake replaying conversations. She questioned her own memory. Had she really paused too long? Had she repeated herself? Doubt arrived quietly, wearing familiar voices. That frightened her more than any diagnosis could have, because doubt does not need proof. One afternoon, Eleanor raised her voice, just slightly, just once. "Please stop talking about me like I'm not here," she said. Her son reacted immediately. "Mom, calm down." The word landed heavily. It did not leave. Later that evening, Eleanor overheard her daughter-in-law on the phone in the hallway. Her voice was low, professional, measured. Eleanor caught fragments. Stress, changes, early signs. Eleanor sat very still. She understood then that this was no longer about forgetting something. It was about being watched while remembering. And once memory becomes evidence, truth no longer belongs to you. This is just a precaution. Her daughter-in-law said it the way people say weather update or seatbelt reminder. Calm, automatic, already decided. The appointment was scheduled without asking Eleanor Hart which day worked for her. The time was mid-morning, traffic light hours, efficient hours, the kind of time chosen by people who value smooth transitions. Her daughter-in-law drove. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching streets she had driven for decades pass by without comment. Familiar turns, familiar storefronts. Nothing about the drive felt urgent. That, Eleanor realized later, was intentional. The building was quiet and neutral. Beige walls, soft lighting, no windows near the waiting area. A place designed to feel safe while remembering nothing. Eleanor was guided inside quickly. Her daughter-in-law checked in. She filled out forms Eleanor was not handed. She spoke easily with the receptionist, using Eleanor's name often, as if familiarity itself were proof of authority. They were called in together. The examination room was small, 2 chairs, 1 desk, a clipboard already waiting. The examiner smiled politely, then looked down at the papers before looking at Eleanor. "Let's begin," he said. The questions started simple. Name, date of birth, location. Eleanor answered clearly. Her voice was steady. She focused on breathing evenly, the way she had learned to do years ago during medical procedures. The examiner nodded. He checked boxes. Then the questions shifted. "What year did you get married? How long has your husband been gone? Do you feel overwhelmed lately?" Eleanor answered. She noticed how each question leaned gently toward assumption. When she paused to think, the examiner waited, but his pen did not. Her daughter-in-law sat close, too close. At one point, Eleanor corrected a date she had misspoken. She caught herself quickly. The correction was not acknowledged. The examiner moved on. When Eleanor asked for clarification on a question, the examiner repeated it slowly, as if volume were the issue. Eleanor felt the chair beneath her grow smaller. Her daughter-in-law interrupted once. "She gets tired in the afternoons," she said lightly. "Sometimes she mixes things up." Eleanor turned toward her. "I don't mix things up," she said calmly. "I just don't rush." The examiner smiled neutrally and wrote something down. The test continued. Sequences, patterns, recall exercises. Eleanor completed them all. Not perfectly, not poorly. She was grieving. Fatigue does that. It blurs edges. When Eleanor hesitated, the hesitation was noted. When she corrected herself, the correction disappeared. At one point, the examiner asked, "Do you ever forget to eat?" "No," Eleanor said. Her daughter-in-law laughed softly. "Well," she said, "there was that morning last week." Eleanor remembered it instantly. She had skipped breakfast because she wasn't hungry. The examiner wrote. Eleanor felt heat rise in her chest. She explained the context, slowly, clearly. The explanation did not travel. The appointment ended abruptly. There was no summary, no discussion of results. Eleanor was thanked for her time. Outside, her daughter-in-law placed a hand lightly on Eleanor's arm. "You did great," she said. "This just gives us a baseline." Baseline. On the drive home, they did not discuss the test. They talked about lunch options, about errands, about nothing. Eleanor realized the assessment had already been absorbed into a larger plan. 2 days later, the document arrived. Not a diagnosis, a suggestion, mild concern, possible decline, recommend monitoring. The language leaned forward without committing. Her daughter-in-law read it aloud at the dining table, slowing at certain lines, emphasizing others. Eleanor noticed what was missing. There was no mention of Eleanor's independence, no mention of her consistency, no mention of context. Her son stood behind her chair, one hand resting on the back. "This doesn't mean anything serious," he said, but the paper stayed on the table. Eleanor watched how quickly the document began to move. It was referenced in phone calls she overheard, mentioned casually to friends. "We're just being careful," her daughter-in-law said. Care had become justification. That night, Eleanor sat alone at the dining table long after the lights were off in the rest of the house. The paper lay folded beside her. She did not read it again. She folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer, closed it without hesitation. Protection, Eleanor understood then, was not something you were given. It was something that could be turned against you. "We're not saying you're sick." Her daughter-in-law said it gently, the way people soften a blow they intend to land anyway. Eleanor Hart heard the sentence clearly. She also heard what followed it, even before it was spoken. But we do need to be realistic. Realistic had become the new word. It replaced careful. It replaced patient. It replaced discussion. The document from the assessment was never officially revisited. It didn't need to be. It lived on in tone, in posture, in the way conversation shifted when Eleanor entered a room. People began speaking more slowly around her, not louder, slower, as if time itself had become something Eleanor struggled to keep up with. Her daughter-in-law started repeating Eleanor's sentences back to her. "So what you're saying is, you didn't mean to forget," she would say, rephrasing gently. "That's not what I said," Eleanor replied once. Her daughter-in-law smiled. "Of course." Her words were treated like drafts. Her son corrected her in front of others now, not sharply, not angrily, just enough to establish pattern. "Mom, that's not exactly how it happened," he said once during a visit from neighbors. Eleanor knew it was exactly how it had happened. The label arrived quietly. No one announced it. No one wrote it down in front of her. It appeared in phrases that floated through conversations and settled where Eleanor could not reach them. Early stages. Keeping an eye on things. Better to plan ahead. Her daughter-in-law began speaking about Eleanor's life as if it were already halfway concluded. "When you're settled somewhere safer, once things are more structured, it might not make sense to stay here long-term." Here was Eleanor's home, the house she had lived in for decades, the kitchen where she still cooked her own meals, the hallway where her husband's coat still hung. No one asked whether she wanted to leave. Emotions were reclassified. Frustration became instability. Sadness became confusion. Assertiveness became resistance. Once, Eleanor raised her voice slightly. "I don't agree with this," she said. Her son responded immediately. "Mom, you're getting upset." The conversation ended there. After that, Eleanor spoke less. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she learned the cost of saying it. Every objection was remembered. Every emotional response was cataloged. Silence, she realized, was safer than honesty. Her daughter-in-law began referring to Eleanor's house as temporary. "Until we figure out what's best," she said casually. Best for whom was never specified. Brochures appeared on the counter. Assisted living facilities, smiling seniors, wide hallways, emergency buttons. Her daughter-in-law left websites open on the computer. Schedules, availability, waiting lists. Her son said it would only be for a while. Eleanor nodded. Inside, something closed. She understood now that the transformation was nearly complete. She had not been declared incapable. She had been repositioned. She was no longer a person making choices. She was a condition being managed. That night, Eleanor stood alone in her bedroom doorway. She looked at the familiar shapes, the dresser, the lamp, the quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Everything was exactly where it had always been. Nothing had been taken yet. But Eleanor felt it clearly. She was being prepared to disappear. "This will just make everything official." Her daughter-in-law placed the stack of papers on the dining table with practiced care. The motion was smooth, confident, as if the decision had already been made somewhere else, and Eleanor Hart was simply being informed of it. The papers were heavy, not just in weight, but in intention. Eleanor recognized the posture immediately. Calm voice, neutral expression, the same tone people use when they believe resistance has already been neutralized. Her daughter-in-law stood, not sat. Standing created authority. Eleanor noticed that now. Her son remained near the doorway. He did not sit either. He watched. "This is what the doctor recommended," her daughter-in-law said, sliding the top page forward. "It gives us a clear path." Clear for whom was not discussed. Eleanor leaned forward and adjusted her glasses. She read slowly. She had learned that speed benefited everyone except her. The language was clinical, clean, decisive. It assumed agreement before it asked for it. Temporary authority, management assistance, placement planning. Each phrase carried an expiration date. Hers. "This doesn't mean you're losing control," her son said quickly, sensing the silence stretch too long. "It's just support." Support had become the word used when control needed a gentler face. Eleanor looked up. "Who holds this authority?" she asked. Her daughter-in-law answered immediately. "We would," she said. "Together?" The word "together" was meant to sound reassuring. It sounded final. Eleanor turned back to the papers. The recommendation referenced a second assessment Eleanor did not remember consenting to. She asked about it. "Oh, that was just a confirmation," her daughter-in-law said. "Standard procedure." Standard had become another word that no longer meant what it used to. The second doctor was mentioned casually, not as a replacement, but as reinforcement. Eleanor noticed how his name appeared fully typed, while hers appeared abbreviated. She asked why the appointment had been scheduled without asking her. Her daughter-in-law smiled. "We didn't want to overwhelm you with decisions." Eleanor nodded slowly. Decisions were being removed under the pretense of kindness. The pages continued. Financial management clauses, property maintenance authority, language that suggested Eleanor's house would become impractical once she was settled. Eleanor read that line twice. "When you're settled," her daughter-in-law repeated aloud, as if reading it made it real. Her son shifted his weight. "It's not permanent," he said. "We can revisit later." Later was never defined. Eleanor noticed something else. The signature lines. There were many. Some were marked for her. Others were marked for witnesses already selected. Her daughter-in-law tapped one gently. "We should do this while everything's clear," she said, "before things get harder." There it was, the implication that time was working against Eleanor. She folded her hands. "I'd like to take more time," Eleanor said. The room changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. Her daughter-in-law's smile tightened. Her tone remained polite, but the warmth drained from it. "We don't want this to become complicated," she said. Complicated was the word used when cooperation wavered. Deadlines appeared suddenly, facility availability, wait lists, windows closing. Her daughter-in-law spoke faster now. "If we miss this slot, it could be months," she said. And that wouldn't be safe. Safety was the word used to end conversations. Eleanor looked at her son. He did not meet her eyes. "We're just trying to do what's best," he said. "We." The plural settled heavily in the room. Eleanor asked to keep copies of the documents overnight. Her daughter-in-law hesitated. "That's not really how this works," she said. Eleanor waited. "If anyone ever rushes you, Eleanor, they are not on your side." The sentence returned to her without warning. Not as a memory, but as a voice. Clear, steady, unmistakably his. Eleanor Hart stood at the kitchen sink, water running over her hands, long after the dishes were clean. The house was quiet in the way it had been since the funeral. Still, watchful, almost expectant. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before. She dried her hands slowly. Her husband had said those words years earlier. Not during an argument. Not during a crisis. He had said them one evening while reviewing paperwork at the dining table, his reading glasses slipping down his nose. She had laughed then. "You worry too much," she had said. He had not smiled. That night, Eleanor did not go to bed. She sat at the dining table where the documents had been spread days earlier. The lamp above cast a small, hard circle of light. Outside that circle, the house felt distant, as if it were waiting to see what she would do next. Her eyes drifted down the hallway, to the study. She had avoided that room since the funeral, not out of superstition, out of fear. Some doors, once opened, do not close again. Opening it felt like accepting that her husband was not coming back. But the weight of not knowing had become heavier than grief. Eleanor stood and walked down the hall. The door resisted slightly when she turned the handle. Inside, the air smelled of paper, wood, and time. The room looked exactly as he had left it. The chair angled toward the window. The desk cleared except for a single notebook placed precisely in the corner. Everything was orderly. Everything was intentional. Her eyes went to the desk drawer, the bottom one. It was locked. Eleanor's breath caught. Her husband did not lock things casually. He believed locks were not about secrecy. They were about timing. She returned to the kitchen and opened the drawer where spare keys had been kept for decades. Her fingers closed around a small brass key she had not touched in years. She had always known where it was. She had simply never needed it. The key turned smoothly. The drawer opened with a soft, deliberate sound. Inside was a slim metal case, heavier than it looked, plain, unmarked. Eleanor lifted it carefully, as if sudden movement might disturb something fragile. She opened it. The first thing she noticed was organization. Documents were stacked neatly. Not rushed, not hidden, structured, deliberate. Property records that did not include the house. Account statements she did not recognize. Legal structures she had only vaguely heard discussed years ago. Her heart slowed as understanding arrived. These assets were not overlooked. They were separated, protected. Beneath the documents lay a single envelope. Her name was written across it in her husband's familiar hand. Eleanor sat down before opening it. The chair creaked softly beneath her weight. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. She unfolded the letter. It was not long. He had never wasted words. He wrote that pressure would come quickly after he was gone. That urgency would disguise itself as concern. That family might confuse convenience with love. He wrote that if anyone rushed her, she should stop immediately. He told her he had separated certain assets so no one could force decisions on her behalf, so no one could leverage exhaustion or grief against her. He wrote that these measures were not acts of suspicion. They were acts of care. This is not about money, the letter said. It is about choice. Eleanor read the letter once, then again. On the third reading, something inside her settled. The trembling she had carried since the funeral, quiet, constant, finally eased. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders dropped. He had known, not the details, not the names, but the pattern. He had understood how quickly authority shifts when grief enters the room, how easily silence is mistaken for consent. He had prepared quietly, without drama, without explanation, trusting Eleanor to recognize the moment when she needed it. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She returned the documents to the case exactly as she had found them. She locked the drawer again. No one would know, not her son, not her daughter-in-law, not yet. The next morning, Eleanor stood on her porch longer than usual. She noticed the house next door. The man who lived there had waved to her for years. They had exchanged small talk. Weather, mail deliveries, nothing more. Once, long ago, he had mentioned his former work casually. Law. Eleanor crossed the lawn and knocked. When the door opened, she did not tell a story. She stated a fact. I believe someone is trying to make decisions for me that I have not agreed to. The man studied her face for a long moment, not with pity, with assessment. Then he stepped aside. You were right to come now, he said. Eleanor nodded. For the first time since the funeral, the future no longer felt like something being decided elsewhere. It felt like something she could still defend. The hesitation stretched, long enough to expose its meaning. Eventually, copies were made, placed carefully into a folder Eleanor had not been offered earlier. That night, Eleanor spread the documents across the dining table. She read everything again, slowly, methodically. She noticed dates that did not align, phrases repeated word for word across separate documents, signatures that looked too similar, identical even. The doctor's signature appeared 3 times, exactly the same. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not panic, but clarity. This was not preparation, it was execution. By morning, Eleanor understood something essential. The process no longer required her agreement. It only required her exhaustion. She folded the papers carefully and returned them to the folder. The documents were ready, but Eleanor was no longer unarmed. Just sign here, and we can finally move forward. Her daughter-in-law's voice was calm, pleasant, almost relieved. Eleanor's heart did not answer. She had learned something important in the past few weeks. Silence unsettled people who expected agreement. It created space where certainty was supposed to live. The papers lay spread across the dining table again, the same table where she and her husband had eaten dinner every night for decades. The same wood grain, the same small scratch near the edge from a chair pulled too quickly years ago. Eleanor noticed how familiar places made unfamiliar things feel more dangerous. Her daughter-in-law stood beside her chair, standing again, always standing, authority disguised as convenience. Her son lingered near the doorway. He shifted his weight. He did not sit. We really need to do this today, her daughter-in-law added, filling the silence. The facility can't hold the space forever. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the page. She adjusted her glasses slowly, deliberately. Could you read that part again? She asked. It was not defiance. It was delay. Her daughter-in-law hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she read the clause aloud. Eleanor watched her mouth instead of the paper. She listened to which words were emphasized and which were skipped. When the reading ended, Eleanor nodded once. "I see," she said. She did not say whether she agreed. The visit stretched longer than planned. Eleanor asked questions that required explanation. She asked about timelines, about who would hold copies, about what happened if she changed her mind later. Each question slowed the process. Each pause required more talking. Her daughter-in-law began filling the silence again. "We're just trying to make this easier for you," she said. "You don't have to worry about any of this," she added. "We'll handle it." The phrase repeated itself. Eleanor glanced briefly toward the sideboard. Her phone lay there, screen dark, face down. She had placed it there that morning without thinking much about it. Now she was very aware of it. The conversation shifted. Her daughter-in-law spoke more freely as time passed. Confidence grew when resistance failed to appear. "Once you're settled, we'll take care of the house," she said casually. Eleanor did not react. Her son nodded. "There's no reason to keep it empty," he added. "It'll just be easier." Eleanor felt the words land clearly. Not help, not care. Transfer. Her daughter-in-law leaned forward. "We really should decide today," she said. "We can't keep waiting." Eleanor lifted her head slowly. "I get tired in the afternoons," she said. "My mind isn't as sharp then." It was the first time she had allowed herself to sound uncertain on purpose. Her daughter-in-law smiled. "Of course," she said. "That's exactly why we're helping." Eleanor nodded again. The visit ended sooner than her daughter-in-law expected. "I need to rest," Eleanor said quietly. The words were accepted without question. Fatigue fit the story they were already telling. As they stood to leave, her daughter-in-law reached for the papers. "We'll come back tomorrow," she said. Eleanor nodded. After the door closed, the house felt different, not smaller, clearer. Eleanor did not move right away. She remained seated at the table, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. The ticking clock, the refrigerator hum, the faint creak of cooling wood. Then she reached for her phone. She did not listen to the recording yet. She did not need to. She knew what had been said. That night, Eleanor wrote down what she remembered. Not in long sentences, just fragments, phrases, timing. Who spoke first? Who finished whose sentence? She slept better than she had in weeks. The next day, they returned. More confident. More direct. "We brought updated copies," her daughter-in-law said, placing the papers down again. Eleanor nodded. She listened. She asked fewer questions this time. She let them talk. And they did. They spoke about selling the house, about managing the finances, about making decisions quickly. They stopped pretending. "We'll handle it," her daughter-in-law said again. Eleanor let the silence stretch. Her son filled it. "We have to do what's best," he said. The word we landed hard. Eleanor said nothing. When they left that afternoon, the pressure felt heavier, but also sloppier. People who believe they have already won tend to explain themselves. Eleanor sat alone afterward, the phone resting quietly beside her. She listened to the recording for the first time. She heard certainty. She heard urgency. She heard ownership. She did not feel fear. She felt readiness. Silence, Eleanor understood now, was not the absence of power. It was how power waited. "This is no longer a family disagreement." The man's voice was calm, measured, certain. Eleanor Hart sat across from him in the living room next door, hands folded in her lap. She had told her story once, slowly, without interruption. Dates, visits, documents. The exact words that had been repeated so often they no longer sounded accidental. When she finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "This was constructed," he said, "not spontaneous." He did not say malicious. He did not need to. He explained what Eleanor had already begun to sense. That concern had been used as entry. That paperwork had been shaped to justify a decision made in advance. That speed was not coincidence, but leverage. He asked about the medical assessments. Eleanor described both visits, the interruptions, the identical phrasing, the lack of explanation, the documents that arrived fully formed as if the outcome had already been selected. His expression changed. "Saying that's the first problem," he said. "Consent." He explained that assessments require clear, independent consent, that third-party presence, especially one with a financial interest, compromised the process. "That makes the recommendation vulnerable," he said. "Potentially void." He asked about the second assessment. Eleanor described it, the repetition, the identical signature across multiple pages. "That's the second problem," he said. Procedure. He explained that evaluations cannot simply confirm a prior narrative. They must stand on their own. Identical documentation suggested pre-filling, coordination. That invites review, he said. Then he asked about timing. Eleanor told him how quickly everything had moved, how urgency replaced discussion, how signatures were pushed while she was tired. He nodded again. "That's the third problem," he said. Pressure. He explained that decisions involving relocation and financial authority require demonstrated capacity and voluntary agreement. Pressure invalidates both. Taken together, he said, this stops being care. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The next steps unfolded methodically, not urgently. Eleanor noticed the difference immediately. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums, no emotional language, only sequence. The documentation was reviewed. The medical recommendations were flagged. The second assessment was suspended pending explanation. The language changed. What had been framed as protection was now examined as influence. What had been described as support was now reviewed as control. Eleanor's son and daughter-in-law were contacted separately. Their accounts diverged almost immediately. Her son spoke carefully. He minimized. He emphasized intention. "We were just trying to help," he said. "We didn't think." Intent was noted. It did not excuse process. Her daughter-in-law spoke confidently. She referenced safety. She referenced responsibility. She repeated the same phrases Eleanor had heard for weeks. This time, they were measured differently. The recording Eleanor had captured was played. "We'll handle the finances. Once you're settled, we'll sell the house. We need to decide quickly." Stripped of context, the sentences stood alone. They sounded different. The authority they had borrowed began to dissolve. The process halted. The documents were flagged. The relocation plan was frozen. No authority could be transferred without Eleanor's explicit consent. For the first time since the funeral, Eleanor felt time slow down. She was no longer being assessed. She was being listened to. Her son came to see her later that week. He did not bring paperwork. He did not bring explanations. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands clasped, unsure where to look. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. Eleanor did not respond immediately. She understood now that this moment was not about apology. It was about recognition. "You let it happen," she said finally. Her voice was steady, not angry. Clear. He swallowed. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. Eleanor nodded once. That's what made it possible. The words were not punishment. They were truth. Silence followed. A different kind this time. Not strategic. Not fearful. Revealing. The story that had been built around Eleanor Hart no longer held. It had broken. The proposed arrangement is no longer valid. The sentence was delivered without anger, without triumph. It did not need either. By the time it was spoken, everything it referred to had already collapsed. Eleanor Hart listened from her own living room as the explanation unfolded. The process had taken weeks, not days. That alone told her this was no longer driven by emotion or urgency. It was driven by record, by procedure, by consequence. The medical assessments were formally withdrawn. The second evaluation was declared procedurally unsound. Documentation had been altered. Context had been omitted. Consent had been compromised. The professional opinion that once carried authority no longer did. It was removed from consideration. The paperwork that had moved so confidently across Eleanor's dining table was void. So was the plan. The attempt to transfer financial control was flagged as coercive. The timeline itself became evidence. How quickly decisions were pushed. How fatigue had been leveraged. How urgency had replaced consent. The language mattered. What had been described as care was now identified as pressure. What had been framed as protection was now examined as exploitation. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no public reckoning, just consequences. Processes were halted, documents were nullified, recommendations were suspended indefinitely. No relocation could proceed. No authority could be transferred. No decision could be made on Eleanor's behalf without her direct initiation. Eleanor would not be moved. The social consequences arrived quietly. Her daughter-in-law's name began appearing in places Eleanor never saw directly. Reviews, internal inquiries, conversations that no longer included her. Invitations stopped arriving. Professional distance replaced familiarity. Reputation, Eleanor understood, does not collapse loudly. It erodes. Her son came to the house one evening alone. He did not knock the way he used to. He waited, uncertain, until Eleanor opened the door. He stood there longer than necessary, as if deciding whether to enter was itself a choice he no longer trusted himself to make. They sat at the dining table, no papers between them, no folders, no plans. For the first time in months, nothing was being proposed. "I didn't mean for it to turn into this," he said. Eleanor studied his face. The man before her was not cruel. He was not malicious. He was something far more common. Passive. "I know," she said. He looked up, surprised. "I thought I was helping," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. That's what made it dangerous. The words were not sharp. They were careful, chosen. "You let other people decide for me because it was easier than standing in the way," she continued. "You didn't take anything from me directly. You allowed it." He swallowed. "I don't know how to fix that," he said. Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair. "You don't fix it," she replied. "You live with it, and you decide who you are after." Silence settled between them, not the silence of tension, the silence of clarity. When he left, Eleanor did not walk him to the door. She remained at the table long after the house had gone quiet again. She noticed the way the light fell across the wood, the familiar marks, the permanence of small things that survive attempts to remove them. Later that night, Eleanor returned to the study. She opened the drawer, removed the metal case, checked the contents once more, not out of fear, out of acknowledgement. Then she returned it and locked the drawer, not because she was afraid it would be taken, but because she no longer needed to check. Eleanor stood in the hallway and looked around the house. Nothing had been sold. Nothing had been signed away. Nothing had been lost. Her life had not been spared. It had been claimed. She understood now what her husband had known all along. The most valuable thing she owned was never property. It was not accounts. It was not documents. It was not preparation. It was authority. And that was something no one could take without her permission.